The very first time I met Gwendolyn was in a classroom, my high school classroom. I remember how she looked. I remember how she stood. I even remember what she had on her feet and head that day. I remember she wore these little, I think they were like Keds, tennis shoes, okay? And she had on these little white socks with the top turned down to her ankle. She had on a cotton dress with buttons down the front. And I remember on her head she had this kind of a wrap. You know, if we were in Africa, we'd call it a gele, right? But here in the States, we call it a head rag. That's what she had on her head. I love it. Now, I heard her read a poem, probably one of her most famous poems, and the poem that she's most known by, called We Real Cool. And when she read it, I thought, oh, mercy, I want to do that. I want to write just like her. I want to be like her. Little did I know that at that time in my life that I actually could be like her. Later on in this show, I'll share that poem with you, We Real Cool. But right now, I'd like to share another poem. It's called Negro Hero. Negro Hero. Miss Brooks wrote the poem during a time in our history when those two words, especially when spoken side by side, stopped us dead in our tracks, right? I mean, they just arrested us. If she were alive today, I don't think Miss Brooks would be at all surprised that some of her words are still quite arresting. They still stop us dead in our tracks. After the title, before the poem begins, Brooks writes that the poem is to suggest Dory Miller. Now, the Dory Miller she writes about here is an African-American war hero in World War II. Miller was a young kitchen attendant who went above and beyond his station and over and above the call of duty when the United States of America was attacked at Pearl Harbor. Miller was subsequently honored as a hero for his role in taking up arms against Japanese soldiers. Here is the opening verse, the very first stanza of Miss Brooks' poem, Negro Hero. I had to kick the law into their teeth in order to save them. However, I have heard that sometimes you have to deal devilishly with drowning men in order to swim them to shore, or they will haul themselves and you to the trash and the fish beneath. When I think of this, I do not worry about a few chipped teeth. One of the hallmarks of Gwendolyn's poetry is her incredible imaginative ability to write from the point of view of other people, just like she did here. Somehow she senses into another person's life, imagining their thoughts, their feelings, their truths, their loves and hatreds, their world. In poem after poem, Brooks writes in this signature style. One of my favorite poems by her is called A Bronzeville Mother Loiters in Mississippi. Meanwhile, a Mississippi mother burns bacon. What a title, huh? Yeah. In this exquisite narrative poem, Brooks brings us into the landscape of something she says I couldn't have any rest about until I wrote about that. I just couldn't rest until I had done something, done my kind of something. Now, what she's talking about here is that she couldn't rest until she wrote about a most horrible, horrific killing, the murder of a young man named Emmett Till. Now, most of us who know the history of the United States know about the tragic killing of this 14-year-old black boy. What you may not know is that Gwendolyn had a son, too, a son who at that time was also 14 years old. And the way she wrote about Emmett Till demonstrated her exceptional writing and poetic skills, as well as her many layers of emotional intelligence, her empathy. In other words, Brooks says, in writing poetry, you're interested in condensation. So you don't try to put all of a particular impression or inspiration on a single page. You distill. You distill. Poetry is life distilled. In her writing, Brooks draws her impressions and inspirations from everyday life, the life all around her, in her apartment, in her neighborhood. And as poet Elizabeth Alexander reminds us, it's hard to think about Gwendolyn Brooks in the past tense, for she seemed to focus her writing in response to what is happening now. Now. And so, even though she's been dead now for almost 20 years, but she still seems to be with us even now. She is here with us, and she shows up in many different ways. One of the most powerful ways she shows up is through the voices of other poets. Let me tell you something. We would not have a Lucille Clifton, a Rita Dove, a Nikki Finney, a Tyamba Jess, a Cornelius Eady, a Toy Derricott, Elizabeth Alexander, Natasha Trethway, Terrence Hayes, Kyle Dargan, Tara Betts, Hayes Davis, and I dare say dozens and dozens of other poets, African American and otherwise. We would not have these poets or their poetries without Gwendolyn Brooks. That's the power of one person. The one person who impacts so many lives, and the ripple effects that flow out from there are absolutely astounding. Years ago, when I was working with high school students, when they were in search of a poet with a strong narrative style, a strong sense of language, a strong voice, a strong sense of imagery, of sight and sound and smell and taste and touch, they would inevitably turn to the poetry of Gwendolyn Brooks. It was here, in her words, with her voice, that they learned about love, tenderness, compassion, cruelty, perseverance, defeat, and victory. It was here that they learned about voice, the poet's voice, and their own voice. Being in the classroom with her all those years ago, and then meeting her again at a wonderful poetry festival called the Dodge Poetry Festival, just a few short months before she died, or reading her poems now. All of those occasions is kind of like looking into a mirror. The words she uses in her poems, the words she used during our conversation, the rich, resonant sound of her voice, her sense of humor, layered with paradox and ambiguity and irony, the way she treated other people. I remember at the Dodge Festival, there must have been, 150, 200 people in line to have her sign books or simply to say thank you for her marvelous reading. And some folks were there for more than that. They wanted a conversation with her, a few brief sentences with this queen of a woman, a small dose of what matters. No matter how long the line was or how long the wait, She treated you as if you were the only person there. I remember when I was standing in line, I kept seeing her reach down and pull out the same little slim volume out of a box. And she kept handing it, to people every now and then, someone who seemed to want it and to cherish it. When it was my turn to have her sign my books, I noticed that the title of this little slim book that she kept pulling outside of the box was called a primer for blacks. In that tent, filled with poetry books, I could actually imagine her reading Primer for Blacks to the folks in my neighborhood, because after all, she was part of my personal village. I remember the angle of her head. I remember the way she peered at you through her glasses, the way she sat, the cloth on her head, the way she smiled like sunshine gleaming on red clay soil, the way she reached for that book, the way she made anyone in that line feel as if you were the only one in that big old tent. In that moment, for me, and I'm sure for many others, time stood still. Even now as I recall that wonderful autumn evening in New Jersey, there I am at the front of the line, alone with Gwendolyn Brooks. Even now, I can imagine myself sitting in the same room with her, sitting right next to her at the same table, sharing stories and a few good poems, laughing and remembering good times as our plates steam with sweet potatoes, cornbread, and collard greens. The same kind of meal she shared with one of her adoring mentors, Langston Hughes, another amazing poet whose impact on my own life and Gwendolyn's life was positively profound. Even now. So Gwendolyn, we lift you up and celebrate you every single day. We celebrate you for making the invisible visible, for your compassionate artistry, and marvelous gifts of being awake to life and turning life, the good, the gracious, the ugly, and the tragic, into astonishing works of art. To you, we express our deep, deep gratitude. We thank you for showing us what the power of one person who lives their life to make a difference, is all about. Gwendolyn Brooks, we thank you. Now, for my listeners, this is part one of a two-part show. Be sure to tune in next week for part two. In our tribute to the power of one, our tribute to poet, novelist, humanitarian, and wonderful woman, Gwendolyn Brooks. Now, if you missed any part of this week's show, you can listen to the recording at your convenience. You can even listen to it on the go. Check us out at www.talknetworkradio.com/legacyliving.html. That's LEGACYLIVING.html. Now, you can also find me on iTunes, SoundCloud, Alexa, and many, many other places. Before I close today's show, I want to thank each of you for tuning in, for allowing me to share a bit about my journey with what Legacy Living is all about. Not just living and learning, but living and learning and serving, so that you make a difference in your own life and in the lives of others. It's about being on purpose every single day, 365, 24/7. Legacy living is one of the many ways to make your life count. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Burgess, And this has been Legacy